This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good afternoon. My name is Marion Creekmore. I'm sure you are enjoying the India Summit as I am, and I know you are looking forward, as I do, to this afternoon's keynote address by Gyanendra Pandey, Arts and Science Distinguished Professor of History and Director of the Colonial and Post-Colonial Workshop. Gyan, who's been at Emory along with his wife, Associate Professor Ruby Laws, since 2006, has a reputation that preceded him. He is an original member of the Subaltern Studies Group, a collective of scholars that dedicated themselves well over 30 years ago to uncovering a more inclusive history in India and the world. Their work focuses centrally on the narratives of marginalized people, stories that too often are lost, but are critical to a comprehensive understanding of local areas, of regions, and of nations. Professor Pandey has published extensively on the questions of violence, nationalism, marginality, and citizenship, as well as on the history of history writing. At Emory, Gyan has been engaged in developing a dialogue between historians and social scientists working on these issues in India, in the United States, and elsewhere, including leading a group of Emory professors to India, where they sat down with their Indian counterparts and together critiqued their respective scholarship on subaltern-related issues. Today, in his keynote presentation, Gyan will discuss for us his most recent book, coming out, we expect, next week, and there are flyers in the hallway there, A History of Prejudice, Race, Caste, and Difference in India and the United States. In this work, he compares the historical struggles of two geographically disparate populations, Indian Dalits, once called untouchables, and African Americans, Indian Dalits in India and African Americans in the United States. I'm excited about his lecture and the discussion period that would follow. And so, Gyan, I want to thank you in advance for sharing your insights with us. And now, it is my great privilege to introduce to you Professor Gyanendra Pandey.
Thank you very much, Marion. Thank you all for coming in on this beautiful day when we should all be outside. When colleagues at the Halle Institute asked me to come and speak here on the subject of my book, A History of Prejudice, Race, Caste, and Difference in India and the United States, I was a little uncertain quite how this was going to fit into the India Summit and your deliberations, issues that you're concerned with. I'm still a little uncertain. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead, take an aspect, talk about one particular strand in the book, and hope that it speaks to some of the concerns of this summit and to some of our wider concerns which we might live with beyond this meeting. The history of prejudice that I've tried to write is an unusual one, at least in one sense. It seeks to turn the lens away from others. In a sense, the thing about prejudice is that we start with the assumption that everybody else is prejudiced. We are not. And I think that is the fundamental philosophical grounding of prejudice. Others are prejudiced about others. we, in some senses, escape all of this. And I'll come back to this point. But one of the things I did, and I do it right at the beginning of the book, is to make a rough and ready distinction between what I call vernacular prejudice and universal prejudice. And I'll just spell those out for you in a moment, and then talk about universal prejudice, which is something I believe that we all share and suffer from, if you like. The vernacular prejudice is the kind of prejudice over race, caste, gender, class, nationality, ethnicity, the kinds of things that, especially in polarized situations, polarized political situations, moments of conflict which are fairly open, is recognized, can be seen. There is racism, there is caste conflict and caste discrimination in India, there is gender discrimination. There are policies and attitudes that follow from that, which are often seen to be local, localizable, relatively visible, as I say, and amenable, if you like, to political commentary, to state intervention, and in the most optimistic of circumstances, to some sort of control, to management, to disciplining. I won't talk about that at any length, because that's the prejudice that we all know about, we all would rightly recognize, condemn, seek to work against, even if we continue to believe most of the time that we are not prey to it. The one that I do want to talk about is what I call universal prejudice. And I call it universal to distinguish it from I call the other one vernacular, to distinguish it from what we might describe as the common sense of the modern, what we live with as the way, the most appropriate way of being in the modern world, for which I suggest in the book, and I'll say it here very quickly, there is supposed to be one kind of speech, one kind of demeanor, even one kind of dress, one way of eating. You could multiply this many, many times over. And the concessions that are made against that view tend to be museum pieces. There's some kind of cultural accommodations can be made. You can celebrate certain other kinds of being, of dressing, of eating. You can celebrate many different cuisines. But fundamentally, there seems to be a proposition about the way of being in the modern world, which is appropriate, which is civilized, which is, in a word, modern. And most other people, most people, aspire to it. Even we sometimes don't reach the ideals that we want, but the ideals, it seems, are set in that way. I'm going to suggest that this kind of common sense of the modern is what we all live with, and its consequences are significant, serious, and worth pondering. Among those consequences is that the vernacular prejudices that we condemn rightly are in fact shored up. They are buttressed. They are reinforced by this universal common sense that we need to be of a certain kind to be good Americans, good Indians, good citizens of the world. So I'm going to try and talk about that universal prejudice and illustrate it with a few examples which may come across too swiftly, too superficially in the course of this presentation. I said to Marion that if he wanted me to leave time for questions, he'll have to tell me when I've spoken for half an hour. Because not only because I've just finished a book, but also because if you work on these things, you have a tendency to go on. And I think it's said about academics, they have a tendency to go on anyway. So you'll have to warn me. So the proposition about the common sense of the modern, a universal prejudice that in one way and another, in many, many ways, we all share. Let me illustrate that for us by thinking about one example of an unstated common ground, which has to do with the deployment of an idea that some of you may not use in the way in which academics and feminists have used it, but you will all understand. The deployment of the idea of difference. That is, propositions about how minorities, marginalized people, subordinated peoples, deviants, sometimes they even call that, need to conform to some assumed universal mainstream norms, okay? Very often pronounced as difference. Difference that sometimes benign, but on occasion can be troubling and often needs to be managed, controlled, disciplined. Think about what is pronounced as different, and this is something that we will all hear all of the time. Men are never described as different. Women are. The difference is who's the mainstream. Men are automatically the mainstream, the universal, the norm. Women are different from that, need to conform in some sort of way. Foreign colonizers, for those of us who come from countries that have been colonized, which includes the United States, foreign colonizers are not different, not pronounced different. The colonized are. The people who actually belong to the land that has been colonized. They are different. Caste Hindus are not different in India. It is Muslims and tribals, as they're called, and Dalits, or ex-untouchables, who are. White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, heterosexual males are not different in the United States. WASP would have been sufficient earlier. We've got to add heterosexual. You can keep adding things that make the mainstream. But in any case, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, heterosexual males have never been pronounced as different in the United States. At one time or another, everybody else has been different. Mexicans, Italians, Jews, women, you name it, African Americans. White Australians are not different in Australia. White Australians, they only got there recently. They're not different in Australia. Vietnamese boat people automatically are. Fijian migrants are. Japanese migrants are. And astonishingly, of course, Australian Aboriginals are different. Now, this is something that in media commentary, in our normal conversations, we work with, all of us. So even if we, when we stop and think about it, would recognize the inadmissibility, at least, not to say unfairness of such a distinction, we accept and proceed with some notion of what is normal, what is the standard, what is the stuff that we need to conform to. And that, I suggest to you, is part of what we all need to think about, work with. I'm going to push this proposition by slightly increasing levels of difficulty, if you like, and I will have less and less agreement as I go along, but that's part of the project of the book. So the next level I want to suggest is to think about the tale of rags to riches, which I call a middle-class fable. The fable that in the modern world, everyone can make it. Everyone has the same chance. This is the American dream, but in some senses, this is the modernist dream that is announced to everybody. And I shall read to you just a few pages from the book to illustrate my own discomfort with this proposition and our need, in my view, to bear in mind the kinds of resources, the kinds of support systems, the kind of inheritances that many of us, those who are privileged, certainly, come with, which allow us not only to be middle class, not only to be prosperous, not only to rise in the ladder, but to perpetuate that situation of privilege and middle classness or prosperity. And others not to have that opportunity, even though the proposition is of how modern society, modern economy and polities, democratic systems have provided this for all and sundry. Everyone in the world has the opportunity. And you get the odd example that makes it. We often miss the 99% and more that even when they begin to make it, are pushed down, pushed back, or that cannot carry success stories into the next generation or on through generations. The privileging of the middle class idea, which, by the way, is privileged not only in 19th century England or America, but in 20th century India, in 20th century Africa, 21st century everywhere, this middle class dream, this American dream, is still being held out to everyone as what we can all aspire to, and what, if we work hard enough, if we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, we can all achieve. The privileging of the middle class idea flows, at least in part, from its claimed universality. At times, in 19th century England, as in 20th century India, there was the term middle class was used somewhat pejoratively to refer to the upstart bourgeois, to people who were nouveau riche, and that continues to some extent. People who are mimicking upper class manners, not quite there. In the longer run, however, middle classness comes to be seen as the wave of the future, and the middle classes as the makers of their own, as well as the wider society's destiny. A destiny made through an individual's as also a people's own unaided efforts. To be middle class can be described as the common aspiration of all modern groups and individuals. The ideal society would be one in which no one had the benefit of aristocratic wealth or the afflictions of inherited poverty. The emergence and strength of the middle classes thus appear to be the measure of human equality, of the possibility of self-fashioning, of individual achievement and capability, the very signs of the modern. Now, I won't go into what's supposed to be available to everybody. I will go into what makes it very difficult for some small groups of people, and those of us who live in the United States see this all of the time. Those of us who live in India will see this. Anywhere in the world, examples of this kind can come. The housewife, as the linchpin of domesticity and the private sphere, was largely a creation of this new middle class, and thus integrated into it. So she's supposed to be middle class in some senses, even though that middle class position is a secondary one. It's in the home. It's privatized. It's a citizenship that doesn't give you the voting right for a long time. In the United States, Catholics, Jews, and Irish would not be recognized as middle class. In England, they would not be recognized as middle class for a long time, nor would Jews, Italians, or Irish in North America. And we all know that Native Americans and African Americans in the USA and Dalits, ex-untouchable groups in India, are not easily accommodated in that category to this day. These exclusions, and you can multiply those examples ad infinitum if you look across the world, these exclusions are not explicable in terms of the common sense middle class proposition that these latter groups, immigrants, Negroes, natives, untouchables, criminal castes, Native Americans, Adivasis, Aboriginal peoples, too old really to have been able to get the benefits of the modern, were inherently poor, disorganized and lazy, culturally unsuited to middle-class modernity, which was the middle-class proposition about them, modern proposition about them. To make sense of these exclusions, we need to recall not the middle-class fable of liberal advancement in lands of the free, but the destruction and alienation that attended the establishment of modern industrial society and imperialism, along with the economic and technological advances and promises of unprecedented opportunity and wealth that came with them. So it's a two-sided process. The modern has the destruction and imperialism written into it. That is the ground upon which the modern is built, as well as the great technological and industrial and investment advances that it has, the opportunities it opens up. The effects of this destruction, this dislocation and alienation, have been marked among working people, the working classes, and immigrant populations. Immigrant populations are usually uprooted working people themselves, the vast majority in most parts of the world. This dislocation and alienation may be seen in the history of several immigrant groups in Western Europe and North America from the later 19th century to today. And they have, of course, had long-lasting consequences in Europe's Asian and African colonies, and in the condition of the internally colonized, indigenous peoples in Australasia and the Americas, African Americans in the United States, Dalits in India, and so on. That is to say, among populations marked out as subordinate on the basis of race, religion, or other inherited social condition, and denied access for that reason to a whole range of public, economic, and cultural resources. Now, in the post-colony, like the United States today or India today, as much as in the colony, there are practices of segregation that continue, practices of denial that continue, even if these are not officially shored up in the way they once upon a time used to be. Numerous studies of African American middle classes, and this applies to Atlanta. There's a great book by a man called Kevin Cruz called White Flight, but there are many other studies of this kind, will tell you of how African Americans, as they've moved up the social and economic ladder, have moved into middle class localities, only to find that the white middle classes have deserted those localities, making them black neighborhoods all over again. And when the African Americans or other immigrant populations have moved up sufficiently to move into the suburbs, people from the suburbs have moved even further into the exurbs. And Atlanta is a great example of this, but you can see it everywhere. Even where, as in India, it is not obviously the case in physical terms. Dalits can't be identified automatically by skin color or appearance. And Dalit professionals, educated people, have now begun to be a part of middle class society. And yet their part in this, their acceptance in this society is doubtful, is something that remains under a question mark all of the time. You will get inane statements of the kind that will say, "You went to that doctor? You want to kill yourself?" Because it's a doctor who comes from a background that is not traditionally that of the professional classes, traditionally that of the educated. The violence referred to above, that I'm referring to in all of these things, social, psychological, as well as physical, as well as in terms of social segregation, is encountered not only in physical and sexual abuse, rape, and the flogging of lower caste and class servants and workers, and not only in riots and police actions, violence against blacks and Dalits. It is found too, as I said, in the upper caste desertion of neighborhoods, clubs, schools, public transport, and sometimes even jobs into which the lower castes have been allowed entry. And so there's a kind of perpetuation of different societies, right? For all that, we say we welcome everybody. Everybody has the same chances, and this can be reproduced all of the time. A classic example of it that most of you will be aware of is the black description and the Native American description of what happens to them when they drive, so that to the legally cognizable offenses of driving under the influence, DUI, or driving while intoxicated, DWI, the blacks have added DWB, driving while black, and Native Americans have said DWI is not driving while intoxicated, it is driving while Indian. And I think those sorts of things speak to the kinds of inheritances we are loath to question. The inheritance that the American dream is available to all. The inheritance, the common sense, the prejudice that anyone can make it as long as they really try. I'll leave that one there. You may have things to say about it. Certainly, I can say to you that the number of Dalit officers and bureaucrats, government officers, and professionals I've met who are bitter and angry about the way in which they're treated by their peers, and who are even doubtful about the designation of themselves as middle class, who will say very often, "Why do you call us middle class?" Because they live in circumstances and they live with the lack of inherited resources and privileges that will allow the comfort that this will be passed on, that their children will be in the same position for all that they've done to make it in this position. And I've seen this from leading political figures, very well-established bureaucrats, and obviously less comfortable Dalit background people from low caste backgrounds. I'm going to push this to my third. How many minutes do you have?
It's 25 minutes out.
Oh, sorry, 15 more? Okay. I may be able to make it. But I'm going to push this to the question of inherited common sense and universal prejudice a step further by considering something that is rather more difficult and that I'm still working through. It's not part of my book. Part of it's part of my book, one part is not. And that is by considering the question of rape and the body. I've just returned from India 2 days ago, and the question of rape is now a national issue. It's actually being discussed in a way that it has not been for a very long time. It has been discussed even at the national level periodically because of the force of the women's movement, but it's never had this kind of national attention and this kind of recognition of the need to do something about it in the wake of events that happened in December, but events that actually happen in India, in South Africa, in the United States, and all over the world every day. So I want to talk about the significance of the body in relation to this middle-class dream, to the promise that we can all make it. I have already referred to it in terms of what physical appearance and demeanor means in the United States, DWI and DWB. There's a question of appropriate belonging and a privilege that is yours by right. How many of us have friends, colleagues, who happen to be African American, who have been stopped because they were driving a car and asked, "Where did you get this car?" How many of us, I have a very distinguished anthropologist colleague teaching in the City University of New York, born in Saudi Arabia with a Muslim name, with a British passport. He's dual citizenship, British and American. How many of us are stopped at the airport every single time they come home, come to this country, come home, and asked, "Where did you get this passport?" Because he was born in Saudi Arabia. And he is one of the most distinguished anthropologists of this country, one of the most distinguished scholars of the world. Immensely sophisticated. And all you can do is stand there and respond to some young official asking you this question: "Where did you get this passport?" So it's in that context that I want to ask a series of things. How many of us, all of you know this story about Henry Louis Gates arriving back from somewhere in China, I think, last year, and being accosted by the police. Someone rang, a neighbor rang, when they found him and his driver, both black men, trying to enter his own home in a Cambridge neighborhood. And the police arrives and says to him, "What are you doing here? Can you prove that you are you?" How many of us have to encounter that kind of thing? How many of us, we're not going to be presidents, as it happens, but how many of us would have thought it possible that a black president, the first black president of this country, would be treated, would have the kind of invectives thrown at him that he has had? "You lie, Mr. President." Imam Barack Hussein Obama, the birthing controversy. How many white presidents would have gone through that? All of this craziness, without any substance at all, as everyone, even those who are sort of piling it on, know, in spite of this president's incredible sophistication, incredible intelligence, and achievements. So if the body does not count, we're fooling ourselves if we think the body does not count. It counts at every level, in this society and in India. In India, there is constant refrain. There is a constant refrain in the media and in the conversation of us, privileged middle-class people. Constant conversation about corruption and criminality amongst Dalits, amongst these ex-untouchable groups who are now in some positions of influence, amongst Dalit officials, amongst Dalits in general, amongst political leaders, and nothing of the same kind, nothing of the same insistent charge and call for court action, for judicial inquiries, etc., takes place against the upper caste officials and leaders who are doing exactly the same sort of thing and have been doing it much longer and quite often doing it much more successfully. But we just don't have it. The fact of a certain demeanor, a certain background, produces certain kinds of questions which are about judicial fairness, lack of corruption, what have you. I wrote this book, as I said to you, before the question of rape gained the national attention that it has gained in India since December last year. For this, among other reasons, it is missing a chapter on the question that it could have greatly benefited from. For an inquiry into the question of rape would draw pointed attention to an inherited common sense about the body, and about the body that counts in the discourse on rape. And once again, all of us know it, but we do not always foreground this. We do not always live with it in the way we should. Thus, the animated debate on the issue that has broken out in India has focused for many defenders of the traditional order, not on the culture of misogyny that rules the land, and not only India. Once again, I want to make this, it's a much more general statement, but not on the culture of misogyny, which leads to discrimination against, the ill treatment of, and even the murder of infant girls. To this day, while I was in India, I saw reports from Bangalore, one of our most sophisticated IT cities and a wonderful center of culture, from Bangalore, from Bikaner in Rajasthan, which is not known as such a modern city, of little girls being bashed and killed. Little girls, because the parents didn't want them. But there is no focus on this culture of misogyny in talking about rape. There is also not, astonishingly for our times, but still perhaps predictably, there is not a focus on the body of the rapist, the attacker and the criminal. The focus is on the body of the raped. And so the attention from the defenders of the old order in India has the commentary has been of this kind, and I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples. Rape has been declared to be a problem of India. This is good for an India summit. Of India, not of Bharat. The Hindu right wing makes this distinction between a traditional India that it calls Bharat in the Hindi Indian language term for the country. The problem is one of the modern sector, of the westernized part of the country. It is India that is really suffering this. Bharat, they tell us, this traditional, beautiful land, never had this problem. After what I just told you about these 2 little girls. The court cases, doctors saying this girl has been bashed against the ground, her head has been bashed. It's unimaginable that this should go on and should be allowed to go on in this day and age. But one proposition is the question of rape, the problem of rape is a problem in India, not in Bharat. It is the handiwork, they go on to give us more complicated arguments, it's the handiwork of deracinated migrant, that is usually lower class migrant workers, right? Youth. It is deracinated youth, migrant youth, drawn into the cities where they are single, frustrated, and subject to the influence of Western media and Western cultural stereotypes. The problem of modernization of industry. All of this. But most critically, it is a problem created by women themselves. It is the fact that women are not sufficiently covered. They are immodestly dressed. And they are out in places where they should not be. So we have, in this wonderful, new, shining India of the IT revolution and of colossal money being made, and the numbers of millionaires that India is producing, not just vies with any country in the world. In this country of colossal, extraordinary wealth, women who are highly educated, who are being drawn into service sector opportunities, IT opportunities, who are being told to work in call centers. These calls that we make at night, and we get somebody in Hyderabad or in Bombay or wherever it may be, and they're trying to speak with an American accent while you can hear the Hyderabadi or the Marathi accent. these women are being called into these jobs, underpaid in many, many ways, all of the time, but they're being told, don't go out at night. Don't go out and go into buses. Don't go on the streets. Don't go into taxis. But work in the call centers. Let's have the IT revolution. It's an extraordinary thing. It is the women who are to blame. And it goes to this point that the head priest of the Madurai Mutt, called the Madurai Adhinam, in December, at the end of December last year, in the context of all of these protests, in the context of women coming out and young men coming out, protesting against the things that had happened in Delhi and in one city after another, everywhere, said that Hindu women ought to exercise self-discipline and wear the burqa like Muslim women do. That's precious and extraordinary, coming from a Hindu priest who for donkey's years, decades, have been hammering the Muslims for the fact that they have parda, that they have the burqa. And so we have this extraordinary situation where the body that counts is the body of the woman. The body that counts in rape, that must be disciplined, that must be controlled, is not the body of the rapist, not the culture of our societies, but the body of those who are being tortured and violated day in and day out, not only when there is a dramatic episode of rape, but day in and day out. And I'm about to finish. I don't want to say, and it's obvious that these inherited notions and this nonsensical but common sense social and cultural assumptions about what produces what in the issue of sexual violence, for example, that these inherited notions, this common sense, is a problem affecting India alone. It obviously is not. Anyone who read the New York Times today about misogyny in the light of the big case going on Pistorius will see every 4 seconds, this report says, there is a rape in South Africa. We need to wake up to these kinds of questions. Every 4 seconds, right? As I said, one can multiply this thing with examples from everywhere. But in the context of this summit, it seems important to me to stress that the shining India that is so widely advertised today cannot be a product of technological change and massive capital input alone. The dream of a shining, prosperous, just, and democratic India requires no less, requires probably far more, serious cultural struggle and social transformation. Without that, we only live with dubious and increasingly empty notions and claims of the incredibly wonderful, glorious civilization we once were, that we are heir to, and that somehow, at bottom, despite all the evidence to the contrary, we still claim to be. I'll stop there.
Hello, my name is Jill Martin. Thank you very much for coming. Do you think because of the renewed attention towards violence against women after the events you mentioned in December, do you think there will be a change?
You can probably answer that as well as I can. I would say there has been a change in that there is a much, much bigger protest than there has ever been. And it's lasted much longer. It's continuing daily, as it were. I think one of the heartening things, or there are several heartening things. One of the most heartening things is that people across class lines, women especially across class lines, have assembled, come out to protest, and come out to keep the protest going. And that a lot of young men have joined them. There are many, many young men who are deeply agitated and disturbed. We also had the government set up a commission called the Verma Commission with 3 members, which did something that government commissions very rarely do. It produced a report in 1 month. And it produced an extraordinarily good report, really, really good report. So that the pressure on the government to pass new laws and so on is very considerable. And the government, I think under that pressure, also did something which it would not have done in the past, which is that it because it knew that new laws will take a long time, it passed a series of ordinances to bring into operation several of the recommendations of the Commission. I want to say two things to offset that. One is that the Commission itself noticed that the last time that new laws had been passed to try and counteract and control sexual violence, they were passed in Parliament with no discussion. Nobody had anything to say. It was introduced and was passed. And the Commission said, this is not serious. This is not the way in which serious legislation ever takes place. There ought to be some sense of responsibility. People couldn't care less. You want to introduce that legislation? Let's have it. That's how it happened. This time there's going to be more controversy. I don't think the political classes as we have them, the kinds of people who are in power in much of the country, are particularly interested. Under pressure, they will do something. But that's the second thing I want to say, that the passing of new laws, there are lots of very good laws on the book. What any number of people have said is that the police is underpaid, and ordinary police workers are amongst the most misogynist and corrupt of India's ruling establishment. If you can call them part of the ruling establishment, they're poor workers, a lot of them. And so the first point that I made, that there is a culture of misogyny that really needs to be challenged. The good thing is it is being challenged. The good thing is somebody like me, having finished a book, realizes I should have had this chapter in this book. It should have been more pointed, more strong. It's there in the book. These questions are there. But it needed more attention in some senses, and I think more people are aware of that. So this.
Hi, Mr. Pandey. My name is Harisha, and thank you so much for such a great speech. I have two questions. One is related to gendericide in India. Like you mentioned, the infant children, the girl child is being beaten, and there is also the problem of gendericide or feticide. But what really strikes me is that this is more prevalent in the affluent societies, like where there is a very high level of education and money is not a problem for them. Even then, data shows that this practice is more prevalent in affluent societies. Why do you think this is happening, and is there a way we can change the perception of the people who are already very highly educated? Yeah.
Yeah. It's a difficult one, and in some ways, once again, really, the questions themselves are the important thing. To raise the question is enough, okay? But let me just respond to that very quickly. The problem of female infanticide and feticide is, as you say, first of all, it demonstrates something about that proposition of India and Bharat. It's the educated, the education, the fact that you are traditional, none of this matters. What matters is how much dowry you think you have to pay. That's why the richer, the more well-to-do, are the ones who are really most guilty of this kind of crime. And I think this point needs to be made, because so often it's said it's these frustrated, unemployed youth, it's frustrated workers who are responsible for the crime. And your point is fundamental. It's not the case. On the question of dress, I didn't say this, but if anybody would ask me, this has been said so many times, why are these women dressing the way they are? It's provocative. And a colleague of mine in Delhi at a talk of this kind said, look, do you know, everyone knows, that the vast majority of women and girls who are raped in India wear saris and shalwar kurta. They're in the most traditional dress. And they're often little girls of 4 and 8 and 11. What does dress have to do with it, right? So that's the first point we need to make, that this has got nothing to do with particular classes, a certain level of education, and so on. None of that seems to have helped. Two things that one can do, and we all, the government needs to do it, people need to do it, the citizens need to keep up the protest on that. The punishment of people who are guilty of female or infanticide or feticide obviously needs to be immediate, quick, and it needs to show, right? There are these laws all on the book, but the punishments are not taking place. But the second is that this is a culture that we really must question and ask things about. We all fool ourselves about just how much like goddesses our mothers and our sisters are. Our mothers and our sisters are not treated like goddesses at all. But this is the discourse. It just continues like that. You had another question, I think.
This is about the reservation system in India, where in educational institutions, some of the the admissions are reserved for certain categories, and especially for the Dalits. But we do see that there are reservations for some backward classes as well, but we see that they are rising really quickly, and most of them have become either they have converted to middle class or the upper class. Do you think that there is still a need for the reservation system in educational institutions? I can understand if in jobs people might be discriminated based on the caste system, so they might need reservations there, but I still, do you think there is a need for this in education?
Here we're going to disagree.
Okay.
Because my view is that, in fact, reservations, especially in educational institutions, have been a really, really important move. And the fact that the framers of the Indian Constitution had said for 10 years, it was clear that in 10 years they couldn't abandon them. And they've been perpetuated. Now there's a kind of political will, a political impasse. It's very difficult to get rid of them, and reservations have expanded. I'm not sure that that's such a good thing. I'm not sure there's now been a move to have reservations in promotions within the services. I'm not sure that's a good thing either. But I just want to say, I think on balance, the question of reservations, that is a quota that is laid aside for the lowest castes and classes have been introduced into that, and for women in educational institutions at all sorts of levels, and in public service, again, at all sorts of levels. I think on balance that has been a good and a very important thing for Indian democracy. We would not have the kind of democratic functioning and the possibility of debating many of these issues without those reservations. And I think it's important for us to say, and for you to recognize, we all recognize it, but again, we don't say it often enough, that there have been long enough reservations for the upper castes and the upper classes. They have been able to pay the lakhs of rupees that are required to get their incompetent children into medical colleges and engineering schools and so on and so forth. I mean, they're also competent children. Not all of them are incompetent. But the fact is that large numbers of people are getting into these things because of the wealth and the privilege that their families have. And I think we should recognize that, and recognize that there's a need for some kind of action to set that right.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Before you start, is everyone able to hear in the back? No. No. Can we talk just a little bit louder if we could? I'm afraid it won't be louder.
I have that on. I'm sorry, but I'm happy to shout. I wish you'd just said earlier that you couldn't hear. I'm sorry. Go on.
Hi, my name's Gayatri. I guess my question is a follow-up to Harisha's question. We're friends, so I think that's why we both kind of caught onto the misogyny.
You don't have a whole team?
No, they're coming. I think, when your speech ended, I guess one of the biggest misconceptions that we have in India, in my opinion, is that we used to be this fabulous civilization, and it's sort of diluted at some point, or, something's happened and something's going wrong. But I strongly feel that a large part of misogyny is sort of built into the way that we lead our lives. Like, I am from a Tamil Brahmin family, and most of our practices in general involve the woman being in the kitchen and cooking for hours on end. Like, when I moved to the States, my first Thanksgiving, it was awesome because everybody was cooking together and drinking and having a good time. And it was not like your mom was in the kitchen for 5 hours and you were guilty that she was in the kitchen, but your cousins were outside. This is really complicated. I mean, that was not happening. And I feel like while trying to fight a cultural norm that is misogyny, which is, it's taken us long enough to realize that some of us, like me, are lucky enough to escape and run away and come to other countries instead of trying to fight it. But how do you think we can fight it when it's so ingrained in our like way of thinking.
I'm going to move up here so that you might be able to hear me better. I've got a thing on, but this will amplify it twice over. You've said several things which are important to comment on or think about. One is, now that we've finally recognized the culture of misogyny. I'm not sure we have. You have, maybe I have, but I do not think there is widespread recognition that what we have in India and in many other parts of the world is a culture that is misogynistic fundamentally. We want to mark that. I want to say two other things before I respond to a question I can't answer, which is how do we solve this? I want to say first that the notion of the wonder that was India, this glorious ancient civilization, is one that we can happily live with. It was very important for us to propagate this, especially when the British were denigrating what India was and were suggesting, you have no history, you have no this, you have no that, all of that's fine. But I think what we need to recognize, all of us, is that the wonder that is the United States, the wonder that is India, the wonder that is anything, anywhere, is always contradictory. There is no such thing as utopia. It has never existed, it never will exist. So even the most wonderful of civilizations and societies have had deep contradictions, have had hierarchies, have had inequalities, which it has been necessary for people to fight in the past. And so, two points that I'll make about the other things you said. One is, in a world that now recognizes the rights of all human beings are born equal, and they must have equal rights or equal opportunities in some way. Democratic societies or democracy becomes the ideal for all. Once we have that, then the kinds of inequalities and the kinds of hierarchies that were acceptable, that were thought of as natural and so on, now there's a question mark about them. And it's important for us to point these out, to work against them all of the time, wherever we can. In our classrooms, there are hierarchies and inequalities and oppressions, which we need to challenge, seek to make these situations more democratic. The last thing is, you escaped, you said, you are happy, and that's a very good thing. I think it's very important to recognize that even when you escape, you have a struggle in your home, with friends, what have you. But the most vital thing is, people who have not left India are struggling. The women's movement is one of the most heartening things that there is in India. And while national level politics there, as here, as in many other parts of the world, is, something that one really kind of is a bit ashamed of, embarrassed about, local level politics, protests of NGOs, small groups of people working together, trying to change situations here and there, women working in rural and urban panchayats. These people have produced remarkable results at the local level. These results will take a long time to have the kind of impact and to change the culture in the way in which you and I would want. But they're going on. So I think all one can do is join those struggles in the best ways we can.
Thanks. I'm sorry.
We've got several others, and we've got 5 minutes,
Okay,
so if
thanks.
you don't mind, I think we ought to alternate microphones now.
Okay. I'm glad we have a gentleman on the other side. I was beginning to think that the ladies were on one side and the men on the other. We've known each other for a little while, and I'm going to take the liberty of saying that I think you fell into your own trap. You talked about that the discourse on rape focuses on the bodies of women, not on the bodies of men. And yet when you spoke, all you spoke about was the bodies of women. So I'm going to try to push you off the cliff and get you to talk for a few minutes about the bodies of men in the context of rape.
Yeah. I'm going to say that's more logical than substantive. It's fair to say I actually focused on the body of men because that's what I was seeking to do. I was saying that's where the discourse goes straight away. I'm not quite sure how I would talk or anyone would talk about the bodies of men, the bodies of rapists. Let me just say one. Okay,
That's even worse.
Sorry?
That's even worse.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Because what that points out to me, what it suggests to me, is that we're in a world where there are things we have not addressed. We do not have the language to address it. We do not have the vocabulary. We have not started a conversation. And so it is hard for me to say, this is what I would say about the bodies of men, of the rapist. I do not know where to begin. We do not have the information put together. And I'll just say, once again, gun violence is a very good parallel. What happens when we talk about gun violence? Not the culture of aggression, of self-protection, of self-aggrandizement, of, it's my right to preserve my space, but the mental capability of the poor little boy or young man who's supposed to have gone on this rampage. You shift the ground quickly. Now, quite how we would talk about that culture of aggression and self-aggrandizement, which I want to write about. I have as a long-term project, Swagger, a history in the works. But the fact of the matter is, at the moment, I do not know that we have the vocabulary or the wherewithal or the information to speak about this culture of aggression that underscores, pins, and shores up and perpetuates and makes awful the gun violence that we face all of the time.
We have only 2 more minutes, so I suggest you let each person ask their question, and then you take the last couple of minutes to try to answer as many as you can. So why don't we just each ask our question, and then he will respond.
Okay. My question has to do with the idea of beauty and the
Can
media.
I take your name?
Oh, Karyata is
Kanyata?
Karyata. The media and the idea of beauty. I'm a huge Bollywood fan, so I watch Bollywood all the time. And as you can notice that in Bollywood, the people that appear there are either fair and have light color eyes, like Aishwarya Rai, for example, green eyes, fair. That's not the typical Indian you would see around. And to my shock, one of my favorite stars, which is Shah Rukh Khan, he showed up in skin bleaching ad, promoting skin bleaching. And I have friends who are Indian, and one of my friends, Napur, from Gujarat, when she was telling me a story, and she was like, when she was born, her mom was like, oh, thank God, you're fair. This way it's easier for us to find your husband. And to a person who's an African and who's been raised in America, this seems to be an issue to me, and I just want to know how is the issue being talked about, because it seems like it's in the media all the time, promotion of skin bleaching. How is this being addressed? Is it being addressed at all? Is it like, how did it develop, and it's a cultural thing? Can you just elaborate on that for me? Thank you.
Keep your question as short as you can. Sorry. Good question.
My question is with respect to some of the problems you mentioned and tackling them, because I thought about it myself, and the first thing that comes to mind, especially with women issues, is you turn towards the political class, and everyone knows about the statements they issue, which is probably an indictment of our education. But then you turn towards education, and we have lack of resources to probably educate 1 billion people, which is then again circles back to political will and the ability of the political class to tackle the problems that are widespread. So do you think that the problem at the end of the day is just about our lack of resources to some respect, but the will of the political class to do something with those resources, or just to let the situation be as it is and do whatever they do best, which is probably corruption?
Thank you.
What's your name? Could I take your name?
Vikrant.
Vikrant?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Anand. So I am a male Hindu, Brahmin, and Maharashtrian, and so when I go to Mumbai, I have a certain amount of privilege, American-born. And my question is, basically, as a person with certain privileges, how do I balance that with trying to create progressive change, particularly within the household? For example, recently I got into a scuffle with my sister about her wedding ceremony, where I was trying to kind of chastise her for upholding Ganyadan and Ganfirna, which kind of promote this misogynistic culture of giving away the daughter and trying to protect the women. And how do we emphasize the cultural values that help to create equality, that help to promote the power and beauty of women, internal beauty of women?
Please make it quick. I'm being pressed to cut us all.
Okay, my name is Edgar. Edgar.
Perfect.
Okay. Your analysis of prejudice really looked at modern prejudice, but if you look at classical Greece, Hellenes were the civilized and everyone else were barbarians, and you've that goes throughout Roman culture into Western culture. Could you sort of contrast modern prejudice with ancient prejudice, and also look at how modern prejudice is derived from post-colonialism?
Since we do have to close off, we'll let you have the last say.
The last word needs to be just thank you. But I'll just say to Karyasa, because the other questions are, thank you for saying just a minute, because clearly I can't answer your questions. And fortunately, our books, however ambitious they are, and mine's a very ambitious book, still has, limits. And so I couldn't do much more than the modern prejudice. If I've done some justice to that, that's worthwhile. Anand, I'm just going backwards because I want to get to Karyasa's, which is the question we haven't addressed at all. I don't think you can chastise your sister, and I don't think that's a good idea. I think it is important to work with your views, to speak of them, to foreground them, and to respect other people's desires, and so on and so forth. There's a much wider struggle. It's going to take longer. It's not going to happen just by your sister changing whatever it is that she wanted to do and doing it according to your will. It's just fairly important for us to respect. It's vital for us to respect other ways of doing things and other desires. I'm not sure about this is Vikrant, I'm not sure about the lack of resources. I think India has colossal resources. It has a lack of will. There's no doubt about that. It has a lack of will. It's also clear that education is not the panacea that people have thought it might be. And I think what one needs is the kind of campaign that a Gandhi was able to lead. Now, as it happens, the states today are much more insidious and much more powerful, much more difficult to challenge than the state used to be in the middle of the 20th century, even a colonial state. So the problems are greater, but those sorts of protests continue, as I said before. Those are the protests one needs to ally with, and it is possible, I think one can remain optimistic that these things turn, that things may change given the time. Karyasa, last one. I don't have the short answer to your question is that the question of fairness and darkness and the privileging of the fair is not one that is addressed adequately at all in India. It just continues. It's recognized by some of us. There isn't a Black is Beautiful movement. That's the kind of movement that would be required. And how did it arise? Who knows? I mean, it's a very, very long. It's got an ancient history. It's also got a history of colonialism in which the white man and the white woman suddenly, and worldwide, and Hollywood, they became the models, the things that everyone aspired to be. So that's also very much a part of what we've inherited and what we live with. There isn't, unfortunately, a very strong movement in families or outside saying, I mean, all of us go through the situations where our sisters or our cousins or whatever, our nieces, are described as, oh, but she's too dark. It's going to be such a hard thing. And that's one of the saddest situations that we have. We have to work with that.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.